Welcome back to Tiny Blue Games. My name's of course Csaw or Chris, and today we're talking about Star Wars: The Old Republic in 2020. Now, this is my first impression of this game. I've never played it before. I have heard about it for quite some time. It is one of the larger MMOs on the market today, and a lot of people in the comments have been wanting me to talk about it, to do comparisons with it and other MMOs, and I just couldn't do it because I'd never played it before. So I thought the first step to all of this was doing a first impressions video. Now, I mentioned I've heard about this game for quite some time. The main reason I haven't wanted to dive into it is that I'm not that huge of a fan of Star Wars. Now, don't get me wrong, I enjoy the movies, I enjoy watching them, but I never seek out Star Wars games, be it on console or obviously any MMOs, so I just had no interest in it. And that was something that was actually preventing me from playing several other MMOs that I've recently overcome in the past year, both with Final Fantasy XIV and The Elder Scrolls Online. One of the big reasons I didn't want to give them a go is because I hadn't played any other games in this series, and I felt like I wasn't going to get the most out of these games without having some of that background lore. After having played both those games and having a really good time with them, I thought now was the great time to get into this game and see how it is as someone who's just meh about Star Wars. Okay, perhaps meh about Star Wars is a little bit too harsh. I do enjoy sci-fi. As a kid, like I said, I have watched the Star Wars movies, I did watch a lot of Star Trek, and more than anything, I actually really enjoyed an MMO called WildStar that had more of a sci-fi theme to it. So I actually am kind of in the mood to go back to a sci-fi world, and it's just nice to take a break from all of these traditional MMOs that focus more on knights and warriors and magicians, and try something else out for a bit. Now, speaking of traditional, the actual gameplay and systems in the game are very similar to most traditional MMORPGs. You have your typical two-faction, multiple classes, Holy Trinity, tab targeting game, so it does feel very similar to other games like World of Warcraft or Rift and other tab targeting games. I'd say it's actually very similar to Rift in terms of how it feels when you interact with the world, how your skills feel when you hit monsters. It's very similar to that. And that's not a bad thing. I'd say if you're someone who is interested in that more old school tab targeting way of doing combat, this game is probably going to feel very good to you. Alright, so let's get into the game. So the very first thing you're going to do is you choose which server you're on, but once you're past that, you're going to look at two different factions. And here we have the Galactic Republic and the Sith Empire. Now, very, easy to tell even from someone who loosely knows Star Wars. One of these are more of the good guys, one of these are more of the bad guys. You have very much the kind of Horde Alliance feel here with blue, red, very, very typical, which is great, and I think it feels very good. The two different factions appear to have different classes, or at least different names for the classes, so if you are starting out, I would recommend taking a look at both sides before you choose one of them. They also have different races available, I believe, as well. In terms of races, though, I felt like a lot of the races were locked to me. There were only a few races I could choose from, which made character customization a little bit limiting, but it was kind of made up for by the fact that there were so many different class choices. And I'd say on the whole, if I wanted to have more classes or more races, I probably would choose more classes. So it was kind of nice to see that. And this is where things get really interesting, because the classes in this game are very unique and very different, because you're mixing in technology. I kind of mentioned how we're moving away from just typical knights and magicians and warlocks and all this, and you have a lot of different classes that you've never heard about. You have people that are healing with guns and like a lot of different robots and stuff like that, so there's a lot of things to look at. Obviously, if you are someone who's more into Star Wars and you have a specific look you're going for, like if you want to use a lightsaber or if you want to be more of a bounty hunter style, that definitely would have some weight there, but there's a lot to choose from. And more than that, there's also specific specs to each of the classes that you can look through, and a lot of them have the ability to DPS, and some of them have the ability to DPS and do a support role, which is really cool. So I mentioned that this is a Holy Trinity game, so you do have your typical DPS, tank, and healer roles. I ended up choosing the Commando. They look pretty cool. They got a big gun. They do DPS, and they also do heals. So I'm going to be taking a look at both of those roles and really just focusing on the Commando. I didn't choose and try a bunch of different classes. I was more interested in getting my feet a little bit into the game and seeing what it was like. Character creation felt pretty traditional as well. It was nothing outstanding, but it definitely had a lot of different sort of preset options you can swap through to make yourself feel the way you want. In terms of actual body size and body shape, there was some pretty dramatic stuff you could do, so you can make yourself look pretty different if you want, just from like an overall aesthetic, which is really nice as well. From there, you go into the traditional Star Wars floating words through space, so it does feel very Star Wars for a little bit here. You get some background information, and it really nicely goes from the floating words into your first cutscene, very much like a traditional Star Wars movie. So I do like that they're kind of doing callbacks to how the movies are done, right? So it feels very high quality. And speaking of high quality, you're going to have some wonderful music throughout the entire play experience. A lot of it feels very nostalgic to Star Wars, and it just feels really high quality for an MMO, which is just really excellent for your gameplay. So I definitely recommend playing with the music on. I mean, it just adds so much. And on top of that, you're going to have some great cutscenes and voice acting. Cutscenes and voice acting have been such a game changer for me in MMOs because it really pulls me into the story. And for so long, back in the day, as a kid, I didn't want to read the text to a lot of quests, so I would kind of just skip through them. And because of that, leveling and questing was one of the worst parts of MMOs for me. However, having played more story-focused games such as Guild Wars 2, Final Fantasy, The Elder Scrolls Online, I've tried to dive more into the story, and when there are games that have a great story and also have great voice acting, it makes it that much easier. So this game does a really good job of immersing you into the world and really keeps you interested even in the most basic quests with the voice acting, so that's very nice. Now, the one downside to this is it seemed really hard to actually skip the voice acting and the actual cutscenes if you wanted to do it in a hurry. It seemed like it would always reset me at the start. Now, this could just be me not understanding how to get through the cutscenes, but if you actually can't skip through them, that's going to get pretty irritating. Even if it is the most wonderful quality in the world, eventually you're going to want to skip things, and it's pretty hard if you can't. And from your opening cutscene, you eventually do get into the game, and you get to see how the world feels. Now, I mentioned at the start that this does feel like a very traditional tab targeting MMO, and that's not at all bad. It feels very comfortable, and it feels like everything is working how it should. Now, if you are someone who desperately needs action combat, you're probably not going to love this game. There are probably certain classes that do have some abilities to give more movement and a bit more of that action feel, but at the heart of this game, it is a tab targeting game, and you know this just isn't the game you're looking for if you want action combat. But that's okay. I think it's good that we have a nice mix of action combat games and tab targeting games for people to choose from. And if you come in with the right mindset, tab targeting can feel absolutely fine, and in a lot of ways it is more enjoyable for certain aspects of gaming. For instance, I think the Holy Trinity in games typically works better with a tab targeting system. It just has so much play, and it allows people to really play the specific roles that they signed up for. That being said, I am a commando. What is a commando? I have a big gun. I shoot big damagey bullets and different kind of buffs and stuff like that, which feels really cool. It felt very good for questing. However, I did want to switch to healing later on when I did some more group play, and we'll show some of that as well. One of the things that made me the most excited about this class, though, was the fact that I did have the two different specs to choose from. I think it's actually 3 different discipline paths you get to choose from. 2 of them are damage and 1 of them is heal for this specific class. There was a lot of ways to progress your character. I mean, you had new skills coming in all the time. You had new gear that felt quite good. Specifically as, you know, a starting character, you're going to replace gear pretty quickly, and the upgrades are going to feel quite significant to your character. You also have, like I mentioned, the discipline paths that you get to use eventually, where you kind of choose your role in terms of healing, damage, or tank. Questing, once again, felt very traditional to MMO questing. There was a lot of go and gather, go and kill quests. The big difference here is that you do have the voice acting and better story to go with it. So at least the actual, you know, reason you're doing these quests are quite interesting, and you're actually quite interested in seeing what happens next. At least I was. And this is coming from someone who isn't really that invested in the Star Wars universe. If you are someone who does enjoy that universe more and likes the background lore, you're probably only going to enjoy this more than I did, which is great because I did enjoy it a fair bit, even as someone who was neutral to it. There's also a good use of technology in this world, which is really good. For instance, you have the ability to have sort of virtual quest givers that talk to you through holographic devices, which in a lot of games it seems like they're kind of piecing together how this would work. The biggest example for me is in Guild Wars 2, where we'll have characters like Timey who will communicate through kind of a communicator piece, and the technology kind of feels like it doesn't super fit in the game world for me, whereas in Star Wars, in the sci-fi world, it makes perfect sense to have sort of this holographic, hand-sized, you know, utility device that you can talk to. It makes a lot of sense. There's also a lot of bonus objectives that you have when doing quests. So you'll see on the side, you'll have your typical quest bar with, you know, X out of how many, you know, enemies you need to kill, but below it you'll also have some different objectives that are bonuses you can do in the area. So if you are in a specific area, a zone that you really enjoy, you can spend some more time there and get rewarded for it. You don't obviously have to do these, so if you are somewhere that you don't love, just move on and move on to a different objective, which is really nice. So you do some questing and you kind of get some basic gear on your character, and eventually you are able to queue for different instances. There is a group finder in this game that allows you to do certain solo things and certain group queued things. The first thing I saw right away was the ability to do some awesome Spaceship PvP game, and I was like, yeah, I'm gonna do that. So I tried it, and it was pretty cool. You get tossed into different ships. You get to choose ships of different abilities, and you are flying through space doing what seems like a traditional domination style PvP game, but in space. And it was pretty difficult because you have, you know, all 3 axes that you can move on. I was very confused for a long time with how to fly and how to navigate, let alone even surviving and killing enemies. I eventually did get somewhat of a hang of the game, but I definitely was not a huge asset to the rest of my team. The big takeaway here, though, is I've never done anything at all similar to this in any other MMO. There were some very brief times in WildStar where you'd fly a spaceship, but this felt truly like a starfight, which was really cool. And you know, maybe it's not the perfect game mode, but it's definitely something that you kind of hope to see in a game like this, and it was nice that they delivered it, and that you get to kind of jump into it so quickly as a new player, because I think that's one thing that a lot of games do poorly, is that they have all these cool systems, but you don't get to try them until you get to end game. This is a nice way for players to do something exciting right away, and it felt very Star Wars. Now, one thing that I thought was interesting is whenever you do queue for activities like PvP, you have the option to do the objective as a light side of the Force or dark side of the Force person. And I didn't really end up finding what these points do, but there's a lot of different times in the game that you can make this choice. Specifically in quests, there will be certain responses that you can choose that will either make you a good person or a bad person. And it seems like your consequences or your actions do have consequences further on in the story. For instance, pretty much every cutscene does have the ability to answer in different ways. Sometimes it's kind of the same way of like saying things, but just different words. But sometimes it does truly mean like yes or no. And it's really cool to see how these different responses do impact your character later on. Now, a great example of this was in Flashpoints, and Flashpoints are kind of like dungeons in this game that you can do either as a solo player or as a group of players. They remind me a lot of ship hands in WildStar, which are kind of like self-contained stories that either happen on different planets or on spaceships that aren't super long, but are solo-friendly as well, which is kind of cool. So it felt very similar to that system, and I was definitely a fan of the Flashpoints. I had some difficulties when I died and lost my helper robot. It took me a while to figure out that I needed to summon him back, and let's just say doing a solo Flashpoint without your helper robot is pretty difficult, or at least for a new DPS player was pretty difficult. But what I did notice a lot in these Flashpoints is that you had the options to progress the story in different ways, and it definitely seemed like there were some pretty major decisions you could do. For instance, one of them was the decision whether or not to sacrifice the engineering department to save the rest of the ship. And it was sort of deemed a dark side move because, you didn't do something that might take a bit longer but saved everyone's life. But what you did do was very efficient and helped everyone else, but it might have killed a few people. So it was a really meaningful, impactful decision, and you as a player got to make it. So it was a really cool thing, and it was something that was brought up further on in the story when the captain of the vessel sort of attacks you for making this decision. He questions why you did it, how you could do such a thing, and it felt, like, hey, I did something really bad here, and now I have to fess up to it. So a really cool system, and just in general, the story of the Flashpoint felt very, very good. From there, I moved on to group flashpoints, which felt very much like doing a random dungeon. I queued in to the group finder as a healer, and it did not take me too long to find a group to do it. It took a little bit of time to get used to healing, though it did work very similar to the DPS side of my spec, where it used the same type of energy, and it kind of got me prepared for how to spend it. So I definitely enjoyed that it was fairly similar, but I feel like I definitely didn't do as good as I could as a healer because I was kind of trying to learn my class as I went through the dungeon, which is on me, and I do apologize for the group that kind of had to just lead me around and help me out. But hey, it was a lot of fun, and they were very nice people too that helped me figure out what I was doing, and were always very supportive of the fact that I was a new player. So I think as long as you are someone who's willing to admit, hey, I'm new to this, it might take a little bit longer, people are typically very welcoming in this game in helping you get through the content. Obviously, we're online. Obviously, we're in an MMO. There are going to be people that suck. It's just the way the world works. But I think if you're upfront with a lot of this information right away, it does make it a bit better. And speaking of sucking, I went from this group ship hand into some actual PvP gameplay. There was some PvP that was more like arena deathmatch style, and some that was more domination, capture the area style. Both of them, I felt like I was getting killed pretty quickly. That being said, I was a healer, so I feel like a lot of people were smart enough to target me, and I do feel like I was able to toss out some pretty good heals. Now, it seems like you get scaled up a fair bit for this, so there's a pretty big bracket, and the kind of jarring part of it is you're going to see really big numbers compared to what you're used to as someone who's leveling at the start of the game. So it takes a little bit of time to adjust to that, but it is nice that you get in pretty quickly because it is a larger bracket. And I mean, hey, it's mostly for fun while you're leveling anyways, so it's not the end of the world. But it was cool to see that there were certain or various different game types, and that you got some exposure to a lot of the different classes. So playing in the PvP, I definitely saw certain classes that I was like, okay, I want to try that, which is, I think, always really fun and a really good point for a game. If there's certain classes that you're like, okay, let's try that one next time, it definitely shows that there are some pretty exciting classes to try. Now, that being said, on the whole, I was very excited with my class, and I felt very good being able to do a nice mix of both healing and damage while I was in my PvP. I felt very useful in certain cases, but there were definitely certain times where I got overwhelmed and, well, just died. And this is really as far as I got in my first playthrough of the Star Wars The Old Republic. I know this is absolutely just the tip of the iceberg and does not at all explore all of the features, specifically some of the stuff you won't see until endgame, but it gave me a really good feel for the game as a first impression. And I think that's one of the biggest things for MMOs, because it's that first, hour or two play session that's going to determine if a lot of people want to end up investing time in it. And I thought it did pretty well. Specifically, like I say, as someone who isn't a fanatic about Star Wars, I felt like there was a lot of things that I found interesting in the game. I wanted to learn more about the lore and find out what was happening in specific quests. I also felt like the classes were just unique. Yes, they're probably a lot cooler if you're someone who's super into Star Wars and wants to have a lightsaber and stuff like that, but even as a traditional MMO player, if you're someone who just wants to play a different class that you've never seen in an MMO before, this is definitely the game that might give you that option. So yeah, if you're someone who's interested in it, I'd check it out. I'm planning on progressing through the game more so I can start doing some comparisons with the game. Obviously, I need to get some more information on some of the different systems before I can start doing that, but this was a really good first step. And I want to thank everyone in the comments that was suggesting that I try this out, because I think it was a really good game for me to play. But yeah, guys, hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did enjoy it and you do like first impressions like this, please be sure to leave a like. And if there's a different game that you want me to check out, please leave that in the comments below. But thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.